What is going on, Chess YouTube? So as you all know, Magnus Carlsen is a beast, no, a monster, no, an animal with the Ruy Lopez opening as white. And by the way, the Ruy Lopez occurs after the moves 1e4, then e5, knight of 3, knight c6, and finally 3 bishop b5. This right here is the key Ruy Lopez move. White brings out this piece, attacks the knight on c6, prepares castling, and also prepares the idea of c3 and d4, fighting for the center. And this has got to be one of the strongest, richest, and most important openings as white, maybe even in the entire game of chess. Now, Magnus here, he's a monster with this opening, and in honor of that, today we're looking at 4 of his best games in this opening versus super strong GM opponents, including Alireza Firouzja, Hans Niemann, Fabiano Caruana, and so on. And by the way, the reason I'm doing this video right now is I just dropped my free Ruy Lopez opening course in my free school community. So if you want to learn this opening for white, if you want a complete opening repertoire for white in the Ruy Lopez with PGN files that you can download and keep for yourself, with online analysis files, literally everything you need to know against every single black response in this opening is in my free course. It just dropped, and I am dropping new courses on different openings literally every single week between now and the end of the year. The next one is on the Italian opening. That one will drop by this weekend at the very latest. Now, in this first game here, Magnus playing as white, his opponent, Alireza Firouzja, he goes for the Berlin defense with the move knight to f6. Now, Magnus is just a monster against the Berlin. He wins left, right, and center versus this opening. Now, there are 2 main ways white can fight against the Berlin defense. Black here is pressuring the pawn on the e4 square. It's a good idea, but white has 2 good ideas here in response. They are short castles and d3. Now, both of these moves are very good. Short castles is maybe a little more symmetrical-ish, and d3 is a little more combative, let's say. But in this game, Magnus plays the move short castles. Now here, black plays the main line, taking on e4. That is the main idea of the Berlin defense. You're trying to capture that pawn on e4 if possible. Now here, white has 2 main ideas. The old main line is going for the Berlin endgame, starting with the move d4, at which point the queens do come flying off the board very, very fast. The main line goes d4, knight d6, bishop takes, d takes, pawn takes, knight f5, then queen takes and king takes. The queens come flying off the board, and white here has decent chances for a tiny edge, but overall black is perfectly fine. Instead of all this, on move 5, Magnus goes for the modern main line and the strongest move according to the engine. That is the move rook to e1. So white here simply moving his rook over onto the open e-file, challenging the knight, challenging the pawn behind it, and challenging the king behind it. A very natural move. Black, in response, knight d6. He retreats, and the reason you go here instead of f6 is on d6, the knight pressures the bishop, which does force some sort of concession from white. Here, white takes on e5, knight takes e5, and obviously there is no time for taking the bishop. If you capture here on b5, white takes on c6 with check, wins the queen, and wins the game on the spot. Instead, black at bishop e7, that is the standard move here for black, clogging up the open e-file. Now, white, the bishop is now officially under attack. Therefore, you must do something about the bishop. So where does Magnus go? Well, he retreats all the way back to the square f1 like this. Bishop f1. So sliding over the rook, vacating f1, then bringing the bishop back to the f1 square like this. A very solid, harmonious setup for white. Now from here, black takes on e5. We have knight takes e5. The rook takes back. Rook takes e5. And then short castles. Now, this is the starting point of this main line with the move 5 rook to e1 played earlier. Now, from here, white is a little bit ahead in development, and beyond that, black's knight on d6 is somewhat misplaced. It clogs the d-pawn. Black obviously can't go d6 or d5 right away. That piece belongs on f6, but is not there for now. And therefore, because white has this slightly faster and better development, white has chances for a small edge. And let's see how Magnus just squeezes the life out of Alireza Firouzja in this game. From here, white d4, gaining space. Black, bishop f6, attacks the rook on the e5 square. This is the best move here by far. Now white, rook to e1. And here black technically has two moves, knight to e8 and rook to e8. They're both playable. The idea behind rook e8, you're trying to challenge white's rook on the e1 square as soon as you can. It's a solid idea. Knight e8 is also possible from black, the idea being you're trying to vacate the d-pawn to move forward like this to say d5. In the game, Alireza plays the main move here for black, rook to e8. Now, white has a huge, and I mean a huge choice here. What do you want to do about the tension with the rooks? And white's two main ideas, as you may be able to guess if you're at least, let's say, 400 ELO, white can either capture the rook or ignore it, letting black capture on the e1 square. And which one will white do here? Sorry. Well, you can take on e8. That is one idea. Beyond that, you can ignore it with moves like c3, bolstering d4, bishop f4, just bringing out one more piece, and finally, even the move like what's the move here? I'm forgetting. I'm blanking. Knight c3, intending a fast knight d5, also playable, pressuring the bishop. Let's see. In the game, Magnus here plays the move c3, one of the most solid ideas here, bolstering d4. That pawn on d4 will not be lost anytime soon to the bishop. In response, black captures on e1. We have rook takes, then queen takes. And part of the idea behind capturing on the e1 square like this is you want to vacate this e8 square for the knight. So the knight drops back. We have rook takes, queen takes, then knight to e8. Black here intends d5. And if black can get d5 in, black is going to be essentially just fine. From there, black may go, for example, g6, bishop to f5, knight g7, and so on. And there isn't a whole lot that white can do to really press black in that kind of scenario. For example, bishop f4 is met by d5, and black is attending bishop f5, and black overall is just fine. So Magnus here, in this position, he goes for a completely different idea. Here, he plays the move d5 himself when we officially have a long-term imbalance in the position. And if Magnus wants to play for a win, he needs, just needs this imbalance. Now, the idea is here, white has a slight space advantage in the center. And beyond that, black, I mean, he can't go d5, and d6 is a little bit passive, but black has to find some way to bring out the queenside piece. I mean, sooner or later, black's going to have to go either d6 or b6 to bring out the bishop on these diagonals. There's no other way. So at some point, sooner or later, he's going to have to play one of those two moves. Now, before committing to a move, he plays the move queen d7. Alireza playing a solid move here, offering the queen trade. Now, the reason this move is good for black is if the queens come off the board, then the pawn on d5 may actually be more of a weakness than a strength. White could be at risk of losing it. Therefore, it's a solid idea by black here. Now, in response, Magnus, he knows he must keep those queens on the board for now. So, what does he do? He slides over with the queen to the d1 square. Queen d1 like this. Now, here, black again has this critical decision. You have to bring out the bishop sooner or later. And to do that, either the d-pawn or the b-pawn must move. There's literally no other way to bring out that piece. And until that piece comes out, the rook on the a8 square is also going to be stuck. So which pawn does Alireza move here? Well, he moves the b-pawn, sure enough. b6 is the move, intending bishop b7. And this does work out quite well here, as the pawn on d5 will come under attack. So, here, Magnus, again, he's got to find some way to continue to press, continue to pose small practical problems to black. So what does he do? Well, Magnus here, he plays the move a4, gaining space on the queen side. Now, here, the threat is actually a5. For example, if black goes bishop b7, Magnus may go a5, pushing the a-pawn all the way out to the a5 square, threatening a6. And if black wastes a move like, I don't know, d6, then a6 could be the idea, forcing the bishop back as c6 and d5 are covered. And from here, the bishop is out of play, the rook out of play. The alpha 0 a-pawn is a dangerous long-term asset. For example, if black's a-pawn is ever lost, this pawn is 2 squares away from promoting. So that is the idea behind pushing the a-pawn. Of course, Alireza, he also knows this, In this position, he goes a5, blocking the advance of the a pawn. But from here, Magnus, knight to a3. Another very curious move. The idea being he wants to go knight c4, maybe intending d6, forcing that pawn down the throat of Alireza. So what does he do in response? Well, we have the move bishop b7, then knight c4, jumping up. So far, so good, all according to plan. And black here, you know, he could go knight d6. That is the strongest move here, but Alireza being under tremendous pressure the entire game here, he finally cracks just a little bit. The first slightly inaccurate move of the game from black, and he plays the move bishop g5, which this is done with the idea of trading these bishops, but it's just a little bit too slow. Here, white d6 is the move, pushing the pawn even further, attacking the queen, and so on. Now, from here, black takes on d6, and white takes on g5. Now, the queen's under attack. You must take back here. You can't go, say, knight takes c4, then you lose the queen and the game. So, queen takes g5 is played. Then we have knight takes and c takes. And then queen takes d6, simply winning that pawn on d6 like this. Now, black, in response, what do? Your pawn on d7's under attack. Black goes bishop c6. Okay, reasonable move here for black. Now, we have rook to e1. The rook slides over, finally entering the game. And we're seeing, even though black looks essentially equal, you know, black does have one more pawn island. Those 3 pawn islands versus the 2 of white. And that does mean that black here is going to be under at least some pressure throughout this game. Now, yes, black has some pressure on g2. If that bishop on f1 were not on f1, black would literally be threatening checkmate in one move, but for now, that is defended no problem. All right, black. The move is queen to f6, trying to trade queens. And Magnus here, he says, you know what? This is actually a good time for that. He trades on f6, queen takes, then g takes, and suddenly black has 1, 2, 3, 4 pawn islands versus the 1, 2 of white, and he also has these horrible doubled isolated pawns on the f-file, meaning white here is going to have a field day just targeting these pawns over and over throughout the endgame. All right, Magnus, b3. Obviously, a4 was under attack. He does defend a4 immediately with the move b3. A solid move. Now black, rook b8. Now we have c4, gaining even more space, and black d5, counterattacking in the center here. Now, rook to e7 is the move. The rook flies in to the 7th rank, a solid move, and black rook c8, defending. Now we have f3, and finally d takes and bishop takes. So black here trading pawns, and he does get rid of one of his pawn islands. However, the pawn on f7 is now under tremendous pressure, and what is black going to do? Well, Alireza here, he finds a very interesting counterblow. He spots that the bishop on c4 is a little bit loose, and rather than defending f7, black here, he takes on the a4 square. Bishop takes a4. A fascinating idea. What is the point here? Well, it's very simple. If you take bishop, black wins the bishop on c4, and black is suddenly doing okay. And regardless, black is going to have the 2 versus 1 pawn majority on the king side here. And that will, or on the queen side here rather, and that means black will have some chances. Now here, Magnus, he ignores the threat and simply captures on f7. We have bishop takes f7, the king goes to f8, and then rook to a7, the rook slides over like this. Now we have bishop b5, then h4. Magnus, he knows he's the 3 versus 2 pawn majority on the king side. Therefore, he wants to get these pawns rolling on the king side as soon as he can. Now, of course, this endgame here is not directly related to the Ruy Lopez opening. However, I do want to cover it briefly here. So, h4 is the move. Rook c5, king to f2. The king march begins. Now, rook c2, king g3, rook e2, and then rook b7. Magnus here, being the GOAT of endgames, targets the pawn on b6, and also sort of indirectly the bishop and the pawn on the f6 square. Now, bishop d3 is the move, retreating. Then we have bishop c4 offering the trade. Then bishop takes and b takes. Now, rook c2 targets the pawn. We have rook takes b6, king to g7, defending f6, and then rook to a6, and finally rook takes and rook takes. So now Magnus here in the endgame has the 3 versus 2 majority on the king side. Now, as Tarrasch once said, Emmanuel Tarrasch, the legendary GM, all rook endgames are drawn. All rook endgames are equal. Now, that is a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much. The point is, even in a rook endgame, if you have a 1 pawn advantage, sometimes even 2 pawn advantage, it's often not enough to win the game with best play. So rook endgames are more drawish than any other endgame. Queen endgames, bishop endgames, knight endgames, bishop versus knight. The rook takes the cake as being the most drawish overall. But that is not stopping the GOAT here. We have rook c7, then king g4, king g6, h5, attacks the king f7, king f5. The king marches up and pressures the f-pawn. Now we have h6, king to g4, and from here, both sides are going to start sharking around for a very, very long time. We're going to slowly speed through the game. Both sides shuffling their pieces, kind of back and forth. Magnus here, he's trying to force out some sort of unforced error, but so far, Alireza, the fashion diva, he's doing just fine. So, king g4, rook c7, both sides continue sharking around. Magnus finally pushes those pawns, f4, then g3, then continues to shark around for a little while longer, until finally he does get fed up with this constant shuffling, and he finally does, let's see, actually a little while longer here. He pushes the f-pawn like this, f5, blocking down the king side, and a little more sharking around, then finally g4, again advancing, and then finally heading into this position here. Alireza makes a big mistake. It turns out this pawn on g4 cannot be taken. Instead, you have to say go back to e8 or something like that. Instead, rook takes g4 played in the game. But now Magnus, there's nothing stopping his king from marching over to e6 and winning this pawn like this. So, king e6, the king marches over. White sooner or later will win the f-pawn. Bang, he wins it. Rook to a6, attacks the king. King to e5, rook b6, rook d6 offers the trade. And here Alireza, he miscalculates. He goes for the king and pawn endgame, but there is no excuse for this miscalculation. He takes on d6. Instead, rook to b1 was the right idea. Instead, rook takes d6 played in the game. King takes, king f7, king e5, and from here, Magnus, he knows his king and pawn endgames. He gets the opposition, and in this position, Alireza is forced to resign, his Berlin defense being completely obliterated by this castles and then rook e1 idea by Magnus. But that is just the first game. We have 3 more very exciting games coming up right here. Let's continue with an epic game that he played versus Fabiano Caruana. So, in game 1 here, we did examine the Berlin defense. So, the Ruy Lopez again after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then 3 bishop e5. In the first game, we saw knight to f6, the Berlin defense. In the next 3 games, we're going to analyze the main lines of the Morphy defense with the move a6. This right here is the old main line. The idea behind it, you attack the bishop, drive it back, and if white takes on c6, black can always take back with the d-pawn, and the pawn on e5 is not really under attack. Here's real fast why. If white takes on c6, black takes back with the d-pawn, capturing away from the center, but very importantly, opening up the d file for the queen. This way, if white takes on e5, black goes queen d4 with the double attack on the knight and the pawn, and black wins back the pawn and wins the, not wins the game, but he gets a nice little edge from there. So, instead of capturing on c6, white here, he goes back to the a4 square. And by the way, in case you're wondering, my new hat here. Let's see if I can get it up close and personal. Synthesizer scaling. If you know, you know. I'm working with Andrew Kirby from school, and we're gonna see if I can blow up my school community in record time. So, anyways, again, new Ruy Lopez opening course in my free school community. The link is down below in the pinned comment and the description. If you want my free PGN files covering everything you need to know to play the Ruy Lopez opening as white, you know, just go to my free community, join there. I'll DM you. We'll get you onboarded and rocking and rolling. All right, the Morphy defense, a6, bishop a4. Now from here, there are arguably 3 main lines for black in the Morphy defense. One is the martial attack. occurs after knight f6, castles, and then bishop e7. For example, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, castles. We'll cover that one in the last game versus Ding Liren. Beyond that, there's also the Archangel's variation, which Fabiano Caruana is a huge expert in. The Archangel's occurs after the moves b5, bishop b3, and then bishop c5, bringing out the bishop to a very active square. Beyond that, Black also has the open Spanish occurring after knight takes e4. We'll cover that in game 3. So first of all, in game 2, we have the Archangels. Now, the main line of the Archangels, the old move order, involves going b5, bishop b3, and then bishop to c5. However, in this game versus the GOAT, Fabiano Caruana, he goes for a slightly different move order. He plays the move order bishop c5 first, intending b5 next. Now, there are some subtle differences here between these two move orders. We can't cover all of them in the video, but the main idea is with this move order, white cannot go for an early a4, as obviously the bishop on a4 covers that square. However, you do give white some other options. After c3, then b5. Here, white technically has the option of going back to the c2 square instead of b3. That is the drawback of the early bishop c5 before b5. However, bishop c2 is not necessarily stronger than b3. The lines are ultra complicated, but overall, black is doing okay in some very, very deep forced computer lines. So instead, Magnus in this game, he simply goes back to the b3 square. Bishop b3 is the move, and we do have the main line Archangels. Now black, d6, he bolsters e5, and also opens up this diagonal for the bishop. There are a lot of lines in this variation where black will go bishop g4, pressuring this knight, also pressuring d4 because of that. And the Archangels is a very sharp, very dynamic, very interesting opening for black and for white. There are a ton of lines, but in this game, Magnus, he does what he very often does. He avoids the absolute main line, and he goes for a little quiet sub-variation. He starts d4, driving back the bishop, d4 here, driving back the bishop. Black, in response, bishop b6 is the move. And now here, Magnus goes for a very simple but very solid setup involving bishop e3, and then knight b to d2. So first of all, bishop e3 played in the game, black castles, and then knight b d2. So he brings out the bishop and the knight behind the bishop, and this setup with bishop e3 and then knight b d2 works especially well given that black's bishop on b6 pressures d4. If that bishop were on, say, like e7, as in the Marshall attack, then this setup would not be the best, but it does work out quite well here against the setup from black. Now, both sides make some waiting moves. Black, h6, guarding g5. There are no bishop g5, knight g5 ideas now. In response, white does the same thing. h3, guarding g4, stopping any sort of knight g4 or bishop g4 nonsense from black. In response, black, rook to e8, develops the rook. Now, this rook, it may look passive for now, but if black ever captures on d4, then the e-file opens up and the rook is perfectly placed. Now here, the main move for white is going to be rook to e1, a very logical response to rook e8. However, as usual, Magnus, he always tries to get like a slightly new position if he can. And here, he goes for a very, very rare sideline. That is the move a3. a3 here. So the point of this is the bishop now has the option of going back to the a2 square, and white beyond that may want to go b4 later if the bishop moves. However, it's not the most active move. White often goes, for example, a4 in these lines, but it's playable, and it does give Magnus exactly what he wants, which is a slightly offbeat, slightly unusual opening idea, which forces the opponent to think early in the game. Now, in response, Fabiano, he plays the move rook to b8. A solid move, nothing wrong with that. Black can also go, for example, knight to a5, intending a fast c5, a la the Shigorin variation of the closed Ruy Lopez. Instead, rook b8 played in the game. White, bishop c2, retreating, and black goes a5 here, a very active idea, potentially threatening b4 like this. In response, Magnus, rook to e1, a solid move. And now a4, gaining even more space on the queen side. These pawns from black, they look a little bit vulnerable, but they do a tremendous job of controlling both b3 and c4 like this. Now, the pawn on b5 is actually super, super weak, and Magnus here, he spots this immediately, and he immediately regroups and brings out the bishop and the queen to target that pawn literally as soon as he can. So, bishop d3 is the move, targeting b5. Black, in response, bishop d7 is the move. Now, it may seem like the pawn on b5 is undefended. However, if you take on b5, black is going to go knight takes d4 like this. Bishop takes, then knight takes d4 with the discovered attack on the bishop, and black's threatening, for example, knight takes f3 with check and so on, and black will be just fine. Instead, here, Magnus, he maintains the tension and simply goes queen to e2, further increasing the pressure on that poor pawn on b5. Black, in response, he releases the tension in the center. He takes on d4. We have e takes d4. Then c takes, and then knight to e7, dropping back with the knight, intending potentially knight g6 like this. In response, white, rook ac1 is the move. Black, knight g6, and then here, Magnus, he plays, just a typical Magnus Carlsen move, a typical move for the Norwegian superstar. Magnus, if you follow his games, almost every single game, he seems to find a way to take an active piece and bring it back to the first rank with a clever idea. And here he plays the move queen to f1. Now, what the heck is the idea here? Well, it's simple. Black's rook on e8, it has the x-ray attack on the queen. And sooner or later, for example, if white were to go e5, that could be a problem. Therefore, he simply retreats, and also the queen on f1, it does guard g2 and h3, which is important if black were ever to, say, sacrifice on h3 with the bishop. So, a quiet move, but actually quite clever. Now, in response, black, bishop a5 is the move, setting up the pin on that knight on d2 to the rook on the e1 square. In response, rook e d1. The rook slides over, and black does go c6 here. Now here, Magnus, he's got every single piece exactly where he wants it. The knights on great squares, the rooks as well, the bishops as well, very good squares. And here, Magnus, he decides it is time to go for the big break. He plays the move e5, starting the attack on the king side. And just look at this with one simple move. The entire board is set ablaze. Magnus here, threatening the knight, threatening the other knight, threatening knight to e4, the space that's left behind. He's got so many ideas here. Black, in response, he goes knight d5, trying to clog up, the center here with the knight. But instead, Magnus here, he's not slowing down. Bishop takes g6, winning the knight and damaging black's pawn structure after the response. F takes g6. Now, knight to e4. The knight jumps in, threatening d6, threatening the rook. Magnus here coordinating every single piece just flawlessly. Black, in response, rook to f8. He slides out of the way of the future attack of the knight. But here, Magnus, he simply wins the pawn. Knight takes d6, and that knight has achieved octopus status. It is officially an octopus with those 8 tentacles lashing out into the black position. Now here, black has got to find the right response. And here, Fabian Caruana, he has a beautiful, and I mean beautiful, if not brilliant, if not dazzling sacrifice. Of course, the idea is simply rook takes f3. The point being, after g takes, then the entire king side is blown open. Black can fly in with the queen like this, queen to h4, threatening all kinds of ideas. And black does have decent, if not sufficient, compensation for the sacrifice exchange. Now, instead, black here, he's feeling the pressure. And instead of that, he captures on h3 like this. Bishop takes h3, and already we're seeing the benefit of having the queen back here on the f1 square where it does defend the king side. White, in response, he takes the bishop, and black does take on f3 like this. Rook takes f3. That was the entire idea. The deflection sacrifice, deflecting the g-pawn away from f3, away from g2, at which point the knight is undefended like this. Rook takes f3. The rook flies in, and here we go. Queen g2 attacks the rook. Now, knight takes e3, attacks the queen and the rook, and wins the minor piece. White, in response, he takes on f3 with the queen. Queen takes f3. Now, knight takes d1, rook takes, and then finally, bishop c7. The dust has settled. Let's do inventory. It turns out material here is 100% even for now. However, c6 is falling. Magnus, he flies in. Queen takes c6. Bishop takes. Now queen d5. Check. Hits the king. King to h7. And then e takes d6. Now Magnus here has the two passed pawns in the center of the board. Now they are doubled. They are isolated. However, they are passed pawns, and passed pawns must be pushed. Those pawns are huge assets here. All right, black, queen d7 is the response, trying to blockade the passed pawn. Now, king g2, defending h3. Let's see, rook b6, queen to e4. The queen slides back. Rook takes d6. Now d5, the other pawn advancing as well. Rook f6, rook d3. Magnus has everything under control. And from here, both sides start sharking around, trying to find any little opening they can use to exploit against their opponent. They keep sharking until finally, actually, several more moves here. We have king a2, rook f4, queen e3, and then finally b4. Some action happening on the queen side. We have a takes, rook takes, and again, more sharking. The h pawns move. They collide on h4 and h5. A little more sharking until here in this position. Black has the threat on b2, and what is white going to do about it? Well, it turns out simply rook d2, dropping back, and defending is the right way forward. Instead, white here, he plays the move queen d2, and this is a huge mistake. He defends with the queen, but now black takes on f3 with the rook. Rook takes f3, and black suddenly in the driver's seat in this game. Magnus playing a flawless game up until now, and with one simple mistake, Fabiano Caruana, he takes the lead here. All right, we have rook d3. Rook d3. Rook f2 attacks the queen and b2 behind it. Queen c3 defends both the queen and b2 for now. Queen d6, and again, both sides, they shark around. Magnus losing the h-pawn. Can things get any worse for the goat? Rook d4 hits the queen. Queen g3, queen b4, a3. Queen takes a3, queen to e5. Magnus hanging on for dear life. And the game continues for several more moves here. Magnus sharking around, pushing the b-pawn. The passed pawn must be pushed. Rook f2 hits the king. King to b3. Queen f6, queen c4, rook f3, rook d3, rook f2, and then d6, again pushing the pawn. And here, Fabiano, he makes a critical mistake. Queen b2 hits the king, but it turns out the king is actually safer when it advances forward. Queen a1, king b5, and the king is surprisingly safe here. All right, queen to a8, the queen flies back, d7, pushing that pawn, rook f5, king b6, queen b8, king a6, queen a8, king b6, and more sharking until here. Fabiano, he wins the queen, but is it enough to win the game? Because white here has the very strong pawn on d7, which is one square away from promoting. Queen d8 blockades the pawn, but then b5, the other pawn marches down the board. Queen c7, king b3, queen d8, king a4, h4, then b6. The pawn, it can't be taken. If you take it, d8, and white wins. Instead, here, black, h3 is the move, but this is losing. Instead, g5 was mandatory. Instead, h3, and black here is losing. We have rook takes, king g8, rook d3, king f7, then b7. And what can black do? The threat is b8, queen takes, and then d8, promoting to a queen and winning the queen of black. All right, king e7, king b5, g5, king c6, g4, rook e3 hits the king. And here, Fabiano makes one last critical mistake. The key move is king to f8. Instead here, king to f6 played in the game. The key move, king f7, f7. Instead, king f6 played in the game. And the problem with this move, instead of f7, is on f6, the king does not control the f8 square. And here, white, rook to e8 is the move. and white is completely winning. And Fabiano Caruana, he's forced to resign on the spot to Magnus. So a very impressive game in the Archangel variation. And by the way, I have, just a comprehensive way to counter the Archangelsk. In my file, I don't use the line Magnus used here in the game. I don't do the d4 line. Instead, my line begins with the move a4, and I show how to fight for an edge against literally everything that black can do. And also in the Berlin defense, by the way, I cover not just castles, but also d3. I give you 2 killer options versus the dreaded Berlin defense in my free Ruy Lopez course. Again, link down below in the description and in the pinned comment. It's a free group. Just join it. You won't regret it. Now, heading into our third game here, we have Magnus versus his new arch nemesis, the guy who just came in second place in the Las Vegas Freestyle Chess Tournament, none other than the bad boy of chess, Hans Niemann. All right, in the game, Magnus here playing as white, heads for his favorite opening as white, the Ruy Lopez. And what will Hans Niemann do as black? Well, he heads straight for the open Spanish, the open Ruy Lopez. So, black here plays a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, and in the last game, we saw black go bishop c5, the Archangelsk. Instead, in this game, black captures on e4. He wins the seemingly undefended pawn on the e4 square. Knight takes e4. And Hans Niemann, it turns out he has a very, and I mean very, specific idea in mind for this game. So, what is the idea behind this opening for black? Well, it's simple. You win the pawn, and you do get a tremendous amount of activity for your pieces. All of your pieces become very, very active. Now, the drawback of this line for black is his pawn structure will be a little bit vulnerable, as we're about to see. Now here, Magnus plays the main move for white, simply d4, trying to open up the center. The point being, if black takes on d4, then rook to e1, threatening the knight is very, very strong, as that knight will be pinned on e4 to the king on the e8 square. Now here, black plays the main move, b5, chasing back the bishop. We have bishop b3, and then d5, gaining space and defending e4 in advance. Now, the drawback of this move, white can take on e5 like this. White does. We have d takes, and now here, d5 is under attack. Black has to defend the pawn on d5, otherwise he loses on the spot. So black here, bishop e6 is the move. Now from here, this is the main starting point of the main line of the open Spanish, and white is going to have a ton of different ideas. For example, c3 is good, knight bd2 is good, rook e1 is playable, queen e2 is playable, and so on. There are a lot of ideas for white. Here though, white plays one of the strongest lines, simply c3, intending potentially bishop c2, pressuring d4. Now black in response plays a very active move, bishop c5. Now, black in the open Spanish can go to, say, c5 or e7 with the bishop. Black can also go, for example, d4 ideas, queen d7 ideas, and so on. Black has a lot of different ideas here. And by the way, again, I cover all of these different ideas for black in my new Ruy Lopez opening course in my free school community. So if you want to see how to counter every single possible black response in the open Spanish, check out my free course, school.com/chessmindset. Link is down below in the description and the pinned comment. Now from here, black does play a very active move, bishop c5, pressuring f2, funnily enough. Magnus, we have knight bd2, pressuring e4, black castles, and then finally bishop c2. Now here, white has so much pressure on that knight on e4, and black has to do something about it. So what does black do? Well, it turns out black here does not defend e4. Oh no, he actually plays the insane looking move, knight takes f2. Hans Niemann going for the throat in this game, figuratively speaking, over the board. Now from here, white takes back, and black captures on f2. We have bishop takes, and then king takes. So here, black giving up 2 minor pieces, the knight and the bishop, for the pawn on f2 and the rook on the f1 square. So roughly an even material trade. We have knight takes, rook takes, bishop takes, and king takes. And now f6. Black immediately tries to open up the f-file against the white king. Now Magnus here, the king on f2 obviously cannot stay there forever. It's too exposed. Therefore, king g1 is played immediately. Now we have f takes e5. Black wins a pawn. However, white does have 4 minor pieces plus the bishop pair, and white is still doing a-okay. Now, from here, Magnus, knight to f1 is the move. A very solid idea. Trying to bring this piece to either e3 or g3 like this. And beyond that, the bishop now on c1 is opened up. It can come out into the game if it needs to. Now here, black, queen d6, a good move, connecting those rooks on the back rank. And then bishop g5 developing for the goat. Now black, e4. Hans Niemann here. This guy is just going for it. He wants to attack. He is just going all out here for the attack. Now white in response, knight d4, centralizing his knight, getting out of the way of the attack, and black, knight d5. He does the same, centralizing as well, both knights dancing in the center like this. Now here, Magnus, knight to e3, bringing out yet another piece. Now we have bishop d7, and finally here, bishop to h4, intending potentially bishop g3, a very clever idea, trying to counter black on this diagonal. Now here, Hans, so far, he's played a really, really fabulous game as black, but he makes one little mistake, and this one mistake is all the goat needs in this game to pull away. Here, the move for black is queen to h6, flying over with the queen, trying to target the bishop and the knight on e3 square. Now, this looks super, super logical. Simple chess. You see a way to fork two pieces, you fork the two pieces. However, Magnus here, he finds a brutal response. The move is knight d to f5, attacking the queen, defending the knight, and defending the bishop. Look at this knight, an absolute monster. And, very importantly, if you take the knight on f5, white simply takes back like this. Knight takes, as Magnus did in the game, and here is the point. If you take on f5 like this, then the move for white is going to be queen takes d5, attacking the rook on a8 as well as the king, and white wins the game. Therefore, instead, Hans, he tries to fight back. Knight f3, hits the king. And from here, the tactics are simply completely insane. The black queen under attack, but so is the white king. So what does white do here? Well, white gives up the queen. Queen takes f3 is the move. Black goes queen b6, targeting the king. The queen slides over. Then we have rook takes f5, removing the defender of the queen on e3. White must capture on b6. We have queen takes, then c takes. And finally, the dust has settled. What do we have here? Well, white has the bishop pair, while black has the rook and two extra pawns. Now, who does that benefit? Technically, black here is up a little bit in material. However, white has just a completely crushing advantage, and white is going to clean up here in textbook style. We have bishop f2, targeting b6. Black, he must defend. Rook b8, then rook d1, targeting d5, setting up the idea of bishop b3, winning the pawn. Black, in response, goes king f7, then king to e6, trying his best to defend. But here, Magnus, rook d4, threatening rook takes e4 as the pawn on d5 would be pinned to the king. Black, king d7, he slides back, but then rook takes d5, wins that pawn. Now, rook takes, bishop takes, b4, c takes. White here is just cleaning up, and it's not long before Magnus here simply pulls away with the win. And in the end, Hans Niemann, in this position right here, he simply resigns on the spot. There's no defending. The pawn on a6 will be lost, and the pawn on b4 will be a pass pawn, and that will be enough to win the game. So very impressive stuff. Hans going for the open Spanish, which, you know, a very clever idea, but didn't quite work out in this game. The main line, again, being b5, bishop b3, d5, d takes, then bishop e6. Now, from here, of course, the main line for white is the move knight bd2. I covered that extensively in my free Ruy Lopez course in my free school community. So check it out if you want to. And now moving on to game number 4, where Magnus faces off versus the former world champion and the biggest expert in the martial attack in the world today, that being Ding Liren. All right, in the game, Magnus here playing as white, opens 1e4, best by test, and black e5. Then we have obviously 3 bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez, the Spanish game, and black heads for the martial attack, starting with a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, and finally the key martial move, bishop e7. Black here intends b5, castles, and maybe even a fast d5 advance. Now, what does Magnus do in this game about this idea? Well, the main line, the old main line here for white is going to be rook to e1. However, white in recent years, in response to bishop e7, white also has a completely different idea that is very, very strong. Excuse me. That is the move here, d3. This move, d3, in response to bishop e7, is actually very, very strong. Here's why. Black goes b5, bishop b3, then d6, and here, white does not have to go rook e1. There is no need for that. Instead, he can ignore that move and make use of d3 by playing other ideas. Now, the main problem for white in this position is the bishop on b3. If white wastes a move, let's say white goes rook e1 here, black can simply go knight to a5, chasing the bishop, except there's nowhere for it to go to, and black will win the bishop pair, and black is at least equal here, if not a little bit better. So rook e1 is not the idea. Instead, white has to go either c3 or a3 or a4, giving this piece a retreat square on a2 or c2 in response to knight to a5. So those are the three main ideas. I cover all of them, all three ideas for white in my new course. So check it out if you want to. But here in this game, Magnus, he starts with c3, intending knight a5, then bishop c2. In response, black castles, and then white plays a very curious idea. The main line here for white, the trendy move at the Super GM level, is the move h3. Instead, Magnus, he plays the move a4, gaining space on the queen side, threatening b5, and forcing some sort of response. If you do nothing as black, then white takes on b5, and if black takes back, then rook takes a8, wins the rook on the a8 square. So black here, he has to do something. In the game, black plays the move bishop d7. So the point being, if you capture on b5, black takes back, and then black has the rook defended sufficiently. Instead, white here, bishop c2, simply maintaining the tension. Now, you have a few natural moves for both sides. Rook e8, rook e1, h6, knight bd2, bishop f8, h3, rook b8. All very standard moves for both sides. Both sides guarding g5 and g4 with h3 and h6, bringing out their pieces, their rooks, and so on. Black tucking the bishop away on f8, a very typical idea in this line, in the Zaitsev variation, in many lines of this opening. Now here, Magnus, in this position, I expected something like either a fast d4 or knight f1, g3, and then d4. But instead, he plays this move b4, gaining space on the queen side. Now, this is a very typical idea in the Italian opening, but it's not played very often in the Ruy Lopez. In the Italian, white very often goes for a fast a4, b4, gaining space on the queen side. And by the way, the Italian opening is my next course that's coming out at the very latest this weekend. So, you know what to do. Go to my free community if you want to see my new Italian course coming out very, very soon. But this b4, a4 idea is not common in the Ruy Lopez at all. So black, what should black do in response? Well, black here finds a very strong idea. Knight to e7. He retreats the knight. The point being, this knight, it wants to go to g6. It's going to e7, then g6, and this bolsters e5, but also, very importantly, it allows black to go c5, as now that knight is not blocking the c pawn. So black here getting ready for a potential c5 or c6 advance at some point in this game. Now, Magnus, here, he trades on a b5. We have a takes b5, then a takes, and then here d4, gaining space. A very aggressive idea. Black, knight g6, and then here for Magnus, knight to b3, a very unusual square for this piece. That knight almost always goes to f1, and then g3 or perhaps e3. But instead, in this game, going to b3, bolstering d4 directly, and eyeing c5. Fascinating stuff. All right, black, rook to a8, challenging the open a file. Now, bishop d2 defends the rook on a1 with the queen. We have rook takes, then queen takes, and then queen to c8, and then king to h2. Black obviously threatening all kinds of ideas like sacrificing on h2. Therefore, king to h2 does defend for now. So, king h2, knight h5, threatening either of these knights coming into the f4 square, that could be very dangerous. Now, bishop d3 is the move, knight h to f4, bishop f1, c6. Then we have d takes e5, d takes e5, bishop e3, bishop e6, and then knight c5, jumping in with that knight. Now, black here plays the very controversial idea of capturing on c5. We have bishop takes c5, b takes c5, and then f6 bolstering the e5 square like this. Now, rook d1, the rook slides over, king to h7, and then rook d6, the rook flying up to the d6 square, a very strong move and threatening the bishop in some lines. And black is under so much pressure here. Magnus going from an equal position to just a crushing game here in just a few moves. Now, black, what should black be doing? Well, it turns out the strongest moves here for black are either bishop d7, retreating, or rook d8, challenging the rook on d6. Instead, black here, f5 is the move, and this is quite a bit weaker. Here, Magnus, he captures on f4. We have bishop takes, then e takes, then knight d4, jumping in, threatening the bishop, threatening c6. And what will black do? Knight e5 is the move, bolstering c6, but now queen b1. The queen slides over, eyeing the king on h7 via the x-ray attack. g6 defends, but now queen c1 sliding over again. You slide dog Magnus, threatening f4 like this. Now, bishop d7. Then e takes, g5, queen c2, rook g8, queen to e4. Magnus here closing in on the kill. Queen to e8, then knight e6, jumping in, threatening all kinds of ideas. And obviously, f6 check is always one possibility that black must respect. Now, knight to f7 is the move. And then finally, f6 check hits the king, king to h8. And the last move of the game is bishop d3. And black here, Ding Liren, he resigns on the spot as there is no stopping the idea of queen to h7 checkmate. A very well-deserved victory by the GOAT in the Ruy Lopez opening. So that is all for these 4 games. I give you, an overview of how Magnus Carlsen plays the Ruy Lopez opening for white after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then 3, bishop b5. So if you want to play this opening as white, like our hero, Magnus Carlsen, this video should have you covered. And if you want even more instruction in how to play this opening for white, again, I just released my brand new Ruy Lopez opening course with downloadable PGN files. You can literally download and keep yourself forever. It's all free in my free community. So check it out. You will not regret it. And if you enjoyed the video, please do me a huge favor. Smash that YouTube like button. Comment down below what you thought of the game. And as always, I wish you the best of luck in your chess improvement journey in 2025 and beyond. And I'll see you in the next video.